Hi, and welcome to the Condemned and Happy podcast. Today we are talking about Ray's experience with homeschooling. While homeschooling is not in and of itself traumatic, it may set up youth to be controlled and have a difficult time adjusting to American adult life. Please check out our blog at condemnedhappy.blogspot.com. There you can learn more about religious trauma. If you would like to connect with us, our email address is condemnedhappy@gmail.com. That's spelled CONDEMNEDHAPPY at my first question to Ray is, why did your parents choose to homeschool you rather than send you to public school?
The environment that my parents were in, there was sort of pressure to raise children that didn't walk away from Christianity. People saw at the time that like your kids tended to grow up and then leave the faith, or leave the faith in a way that felt like they were leaving the communities, that you couldn't really make a faith different for you, or like make it your own. That was seen as wrong. They felt that by homeschooling us and raising us as children in a bubble that didn't have what they called worldly pressure, that we would grow up to be good little Christians and practice Christianity in the exact same way that they did. There were a lot of fundamentalist Christian leaders who spent a lot of time fear mongering this idea that public schools were indoctrinating kids, and that sending your kids to public school was basically a recipe for them to walk away from the faith. Obviously, all these people that were fear mongering this topic all had things to sell to solve that problem. They were selling books, homeschool curriculum. They were heads of private schools, private school curriculum. They thought that by doing what they claimed that the public school was doing, that they would in turn turn out good little fundamentalist Christians that believed exactly what they believed.
When you say that what do you know what what they accuse the public schools of doing? Was that ever explained to you?
No, they would often harp on the fact that there wasn't prayer in school, that the Ten Commandments weren't in school, that history wasn't taught from a Christian nationalist perspective. They would complain about the fact that there were allowances for people from other, that there was an attempt to treat people with different perspectives and sexual orientations and races equally. That challenged their worldview. So they didn't think that it was okay to know that, to not have a Christian nationalist view on slavery and race, and the idea that LGBTQ plus people could be even like thought of was a bit was challenging to them. And so they felt that that was wrong, and that learning about those things would make you leave the faith.
Okay.
At a young age. You would be raised to sort of see their viewpoint as silly. To a large degree, my takeaway has always kind of been that like the American education system isn't world tier. It's not super great. If our American public education system causes your children to walk away from the faith, your faith wasn't really strong to begin with, and your faith didn't have a lot of logic to it, and it needed to be reformed. I think that looking back, it's kind of funny to me that the parents that did raise their kids in the public school and did take the time to sort of wrestle with that conflict between what their kids were learning in school and what their parents believed, those kids had a tendency to stay the course longer, I think, in their adult life than the kids that went from this bubble of indoctrination into the world. That is very jarring. We look through church history, we see that as humans' knowledge of the world, as humanity's knowledge has expanded, so our religious ideas have expanded, and our view of God has grown to be bigger. Our theology has changed a little bit, and it's been less small, and it's gotten bigger, and the box that we sort of put God in expands. To sort of dig at the homeschooling movement, it was a rebellion against that idea of an expanding knowledge of God. They wanted an old-fashioned God, the same God their grandparents had.
Or
And so,
great grandparents?
Yeah, they were pushing back against the idea that maybe God is more accepting, or maybe white people aren't the master race, or maybe that there's more to life than just a nuclear family. One man, one woman for life may not be what God has called everybody to, or what is possible, or what exists. To that end, they wanted to force that viewpoint on more people. So within the homeschool movement, there was pressure and this idea of sort of raising up these homeschooled people to, graduates, specifically the men, to go out and to take positions of power and leadership in the community to more or less coerce, manipulate people into that viewpoint. There are legal groups that are out there that like protect homeschooling, and in a lot of ways they have been very successful at that, to the point that there's very little real oversight over homeschooling. Part of their goal is, and what they're fighting for, is to create a generation of homeschool graduates that will be able to go out into the world and sort of coerce, lead, or manipulate, or influence the world to be this, to live in this viewpoint that they have, this sort of white Christian nationalist viewpoint. They want to have that influence on society. They want everybody to be like them, or to exist in more of what they think.
That generation, there's a term for that generation, isn't it?
Yeah, the Joshua generation.
Certain groups that kind of push that in the homeschooling curriculum.
Yeah, it's similar to Quiverful. They're two
Okay.
different things, but the idea is the same Quiverful idea, that we're going to raise up children that are going to go out and change the world back to the viewpoint that we think they had in the past.
Okay.
That we are going to make a more Christian, more holy nation by homeschooling, and by having our kids go out and change the world.
And so
And
when you
so,
talk about going back,
mhm.
can you tell us what version of the dictionary your curriculum used?
Yeah, so we used Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary.
Say that
No,
again.
Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary.
All right, I'm still trying not to laugh. Like 1828, that's almost 200 years ago.
Yeah. So, Noah Webster was like an English, Americanized spellings, language, and he Americanized the Bible. As an early nation, I think there was a bit of a struggle for an identity, and they
Right.
wanted to sort of push off the European focus or the European influences and create our own identity. And so they rewrote the Bible. They Americanized the Bible in a way that the spellings were different. And then his dictionary defines a lot of the terms in the Bible by using the Bible and by sticking with the morality and social understanding of the time. You see a lot of when you're using this viewpoint or this dictionary, you miss a lot of the Greek and Hebrew
Hmm.
and historical context that
Right.
Christianity as a whole and the Bible existed in it. It's sort of an attempt to sort of ignore that and say, here we are in America, we are making our own thing, or we're creating our own identity within Christianity. You see that like around that same time frame in America, there was this sort of like moral awakening in which sort of history and mythology was created around our founding fathers in an attempt to sort of make things holier than they are and deify the founding fathers. A lot of the curriculum and the thought processes goes back to that American identity and draws a lot from it.
So it
So,
draws a lot of identity from a mythic view created in around the 1800s of
yeah,
what America was founded on to be.
yes. Instead of having an accurate viewpoint of the founding fathers as flawed men that stood up against England, but maybe also for their own interests and were wealthy for the most part landowners and some of the few people that had access to education at the time.
Right.
It sees them as sort of these really holy men that created a nation for God and stood apart and stood up, and they see it more in the lines of like a holy war or a holy calling than as just people fighting for autonomy and lower taxes.
Right.
There's
So instead of like what we're taught in the public school is that the influences of the Enlightenment, the influences of Roman legal structures are foundational for the Constitution. Are you taught that in your curriculum?
no, not really. So we're sort of taught from a Reformation standpoint into America,
Okay,
so
so
that like the throwing off of the Catholic Church,
church.
we'll hit
Okay,
that. We'll hit some of the highlights of the reformers, Calvin, Luther quickly. Then we'll go into like the English fight
the
over
English Reformation is
and
heavily
like
emphasized.
yeah, but not the real reason. Like, I mean, the reason the
Yep,
Anglican Church came around was because of Henry VIII and his desire for many wives.
yep.
That's kind of skipped over. Then we'll go to the Puritans and the Pilgrims, how like they wanted their struggle to reform, as it'll be called, the English church, at the church in England at the time. Then they'll come to America. And then it's like from them, there's a quick skip over to then the revolution.
There's
And
150 years between the Puritans coming to the US and the Revolution.
yeah,
Are you
there's a
taught
lot of
about that 150 years?
no, the thing that we might be taught is that the people that came to America drifted away from Christianity and needed to then be reformed to be awakened
Okay.
in the Enlightenment or the Great Awakening. You know, like sinners in the hand of an angry God, Jonathan Edward, and
Edward.
their religious bringing together of the colonies, like that whole movement that sort of swept that awakening that swept the colonies will be highlighted. They will constantly emphasize these revivals or awakenings where religious things pop up, you know, influence, because they see America as needing that again. They see
Okay.
America as needing a revival or a great awakening again and to go back to God, and that America drifts away from God, just kind of like the story of the children of Israel, and they need to be called back. They see America very similar to Israel. Some will
Okay.
even think theologically that America replaces Israel. Not all of them go that far, but they draw quite a lot of similarity between the two. They think that America has a special place with God and on the world stage.
Okay. So the historical method they're using is essentially reading the past to conform to the present that they want to see.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, 1828 is before the Civil War.
Yes. Yeah.
So their view of who is a legitimate American then is that spelled out in these curriculum.
There's definitely that lost cause Southern influence in them. They
Okay.
will acknowledge that slavery is bad,
Okay.
but they go to great lengths to sort of dance around it. A lot of this curriculum highlights General Robert E. Lee as a man of faith. They love Stonewall Jackson. They make efforts to find people and hold them up. They buy into the idea that it was about states' rights, the Civil War. They'll say that slavery is wrong, and they'll say that God was trying to get rid of slavery. And they will say that, but they will highlight people in the South as being men of faith. I mean, to be fair, General Robert E. Lee fits better into their narrative than Ulysses S. Grant.
Okay.
They will sort of whitewash the whole experience by saying slavery is bad, but they won't always make efforts to truly understand how bad systemic racism is in America at that time or even into the present. They tend to have a little bit of that influence of we're white people, so we are kind of that segregationist Jim Crow is still very somewhat evident in there. When I was being homeschooled in the 90s, there was still a lot of that segregation. I think it's started to come down, but they have a hard time having the African American people unless they are very white Christian nationalist coded. There's a weird little a tendency to not fully accept. They will call it cultural differences, but it's in reality it's racism in a kind of slightly more polite attempt.
Form.
Yeah,
Yeah.
where they tend to see white culture as being more Christian and necessary for life without saying that like black people are inferior, but they would dance around it in a funny way. And they're subconsciously pushing that idea without realizing it in some cases. It's been taught, it's
Okay.
just inherited into that
In
system of
into white
thinking.
culture as
Yeah.
you said something about thinking that white Christianity is good for the nation,
Mm-hmm.
or kind of like that's an assumption. Are they accepting of white Christians who are Roman Catholic, who are
Mm-hmm.
other Protestants?
Not really. So, particularly in the South, when in the 90s, when I was there, like they didn't really think that Catholics were Christians. They
Hmm.
would argue that the Pope was the Antichrist. They would say that like the Pope would be the ultimate Antichrist. Sometimes there was some thought process to that. There was still a lot of that influence, I think, from the clan of like we are white Protestants, and anything that isn't white Protestant is needs to be run out of our town. There,
Yeah.
that sort of it wasn't said that way. When you took a step back and you were out of it, you could see it. It was in the literature, it was in the conversations, and I think that anybody from an outside coming in to study it would see it pretty quickly. But if you're raised in it, if you're in that system, I think it's much harder to see. It may not be overtly said,
Hmm.
but it's there. And that's sort of the hard part of it is a lot of people who are in it don't see that they're in it.
Right.
Sort of a whitewashing.
Essentially, this is the what enculturating
Mhm.
systemic racism does is it
Yeah.
blinds white people to seeing the microaggressions or the
Yeah.
systems that are in place that hold people back.
Yeah. This was in all the curriculum. This was there in all the context of history, in the
Okay.
context of how they cared for the people in their community. Like we were taught to do good works, but this viewpoint of like, well, maybe those people they're not doing it the way we should do it, so they sort of like it's too bad that they're in poverty because they're not doing what we're doing. So clearly that's on them, and that
Okay.
getting out of poverty, well, they need to be like us. They need to have our viewpoints, they need to have our values, they need to wear the clothes that we wear. The men need to have short haircuts, and the women need to stay at home and work and have lots of children, and they need to stay married regardless of what happens. And deification, I think, of like the 1950s Americana idyllic lifestyle was very much there.
Okay. Now, going back to the curriculum, so your curriculum was basically a religious curriculum looking at the foundation of the US as well as the world around it. Did it challenge or reinforce what you were learning in church?
I was kind of fortunate in a way that my parents used curriculum from a multiple different religious viewpoints. So
Okay.
while we typically attended fundamentalist Baptist churches, we used curriculum from Mennonites. We used curriculum from most of the different sources. We had something, whether it was like a history or an art class or math or like something we borrowed from a lot of the different things. I was exposed to different theological viewpoints that challenged what I was told, and that was very helpful because you could learn that there were differences and it wasn't entirely one monolith
Okay.
of viewpoints. So the churches that we attended, for the most part, believed in a rapture and then the tribulation. But some of the curriculum we used believed in this idea that Christians would usher in the millennium by being so good and strong for Jesus, that
Righteous. Yeah.
this idea of like creating a Christian America and making everybody believe like we believed. and then the millennia would happen, and then God would come back. And so I got to see some of that tension and some of that difference. And that was helpful because it allowed me to have some opportunity to think critically about it and to see different viewpoints. Granted, they were all viewpoints within this sort of white Christian nationalist umbrella, but I did get to see different viewpoints. And that those viewpoints are entirely different than the Mennonites, who
Right.
don't really talk about end times theology. That's not important for them. Their importance, is living a simplistic, holy life now and not really thinking about the fact that that may not be sustainable. So
Yeah.
I did get to see a lot of things that were different, but within the same umbrella. And so that was helpful. But then everything really did have this sort of Christian nationalist tint. The Mennonite curriculum, not so much, but they didn't really dive into theology, and their sort of subculture is a little bit different.
No, yeah. And again, the ideology behind the rapture is not as old as the dictionary you
Yeah.
had to use.
Yeah.
Um, it's later comes out of Scotland, I think, or I'd have to do more research on that because
It
it's not something that's in my religious background.
it is funny that it's not in the Bible at all, the word rapture, I think, in that
Yeah,
context.
yeah. How would you rate your experience with homeschooling in preparing you for transitioning into adulthood and getting a job?
So this was the huge obstacle of homeschooling, or the challenge, is that it doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't really prepare you for life out of the bubble. The challenge is that in this viewpoint, the men are seen as needing to get jobs to provide so that their wives can stay home with the kids, which means, if you're being realistic and thinking about it, that you have to get a really good job
Yep.
or you have to run your own business. If you look at a lot of my peers, the ones that didn't figure out how to get a good job all run businesses to varying levels of success because they have no other option.
How do they get the capital to start a business? Or is it not starting something? What kind of businesses are they generally running?
Construction, farming, car salesman. There are lots of things that you could probably YouTube and learn a little bit of, maybe get a job working for someone who shows you a little bit of the ropes. Home maintenance, gutter cleaning, those sorts of things.
Lawn care,
Yeah, yeah, a lot of lawn care businesses.
because I think
So,
that's lower investment up front
yeah, there are
for you guys.
things in our America that we live in that you could come in as an immigrant and start and grow,
Mhm.
or come in as an ambitious person and be entrepreneurial in. The idea of getting a job and making the average salary is really not possible in this viewpoint of how things are supposed to work. I mean,
Mhm.
you can't live off the average salary and have tons of kids and have a single income. You have to have two incomes, or you have to live in the middle of nowhere. I think there's a lot of people that are in poverty and live very hard lives because of this, because they weren't raised in the system and able to get access to good jobs. And this was one of the things that was a big eye opener to me at a young age, that kind of helped me know more about the fact that I wanted something more, was that I had people in my life as a young kid talk to me about that. There was this one guy I remember who we rented a big house from a really wealthy guy who had a groundskeeper. And one of the groundskeepers, I was a kid, I was home all the time. So I hung out with the groundskeepers and all the people doing work on the place, because else was I to do?
Right.
Which I think is an interesting thing. You won't let kids go to school with other kids, but you will let them hang out with all these rough carpenters and grounds crew people that are just, trying to do their job and make it in life. He basically was like, he didn't want his kids. He told me that he didn't want his kids to have a job like him. He wanted them to have management jobs, to have upward social mobility. So he didn't like homeschooling. He thought
Hmm.
that we should be in public school, and that then we should then go on to be really good in the public school, get scholarships into the military to be officers,
Yep.
and then to go on from being officers to being middle management and upper management in companies. That was what his goal for his sons was. And he talked
Hmm.
about that to me. That kind of opened my eyes. That was like, oh, hey, maybe there's more to life than just what's in front of me. Maybe I might want that. Maybe that's like something cool to achieve. And then in addition, our family has a lot of people that are like emphasize education. And there was a lot of family members that like kind of talked about that with me, that helped me see that I might want to do more than just exist in the system that I saw around me at church, and that I might want to maybe have a job that paid well, and that to get that meant I had to get skills and knowledge
Right.
outside of what I had. Homeschooling did not. The thing that it did prepare me was that it helped me learn how to teach myself. What
Right.
it didn't teach me was anything I needed to know. So we had almost zero science training in homeschooling. If it was largely creationist, apologist bullshit, for lack of a better word. Sorry. um,
Yeah, it's all right. You can swear.
it, so like I never took like real physics or chemistry or anything like that. Biology, like there was, you learn stuff about things as you go along, but like nothing like concrete and like this is our chemistry course, this is our science, this is our natural history. Nothing like really concrete about that. There was a lot of history, which was helpful because I think history is a good way to learn culture a little bit in the past.
Hmm.
But it was all from a slant. We did a lot of literature, which I was good at and which helped me because I had a pretty high reading comprehension going into college. This was all largely around understanding the Bible. So that was helpful, but I didn't learn upper level math. We kind of stopped at pre algebra. I didn't learn any real science. I didn't learn, there's a lot of like things you take for granted when you're in the public education system. There's like paperwork that's involved. There's learning to exist within a system, learning how to not get yourself in trouble, learning how to read
Right.
people. The big one for me is just learning that there are shitty people out there, and that's the way the world is, and that you can't change that, and how you emotionally handle that and how you let that affect your life. When you live in a little bit of a bubble where everything is sort of forced to be perfect, you don't learn those skills, those social skills of they're shitty people. And, the best thing to do is to avoid them and to not let them take up emotional and mental energy in your life. You want to try to fix everything because you're in this bubble where everything is fixed.
Right. So what you're describing is emotional intelligence and
Yeah.
the discernment process of knowing who's trustworthy.
Yeah. You're
And
not
and
taught that in a homeschool bubble. You will learn that the hard way as life happens.
yeah,
But it's a little bit harder because like when you're in school, you're with people your own age. And so
right.
there's a little bit less of a power imbalance, right?
Yeah,
For the most part, I mean, everybody's kind of in a similar social, emotional, mental place.
right.
When you're in this bubble, you have a lot of adults interacting with children, various levels of children. You have high school age kids all the way down to kindergarten age kids in a very similar, close environment. The power dynamics are easy to be hurtful, and they're all the same people. If you have a bad teacher, well, you come home and you're away from that person. Or if you
Right.
have abusive parents, you go to school and you're away from that person. In this environment, if you have any one of those things, it's the same person and you're there constantly.
Right.
So it's a bit harder. Moving on to sort of the idea, like I really had to learn a lot in college
Hmm.
because it just didn't prepare me for anything. It was a little bit jarring going from being homeschooled and living in this little bubble to suddenly going to college and having to figure out how to order off a fast food menu. Like that's like kind of shocking and jarring for me. Something that simple is like, well, I don't know what's there, or like, and it's fast and you're holding up a
Right.
line and it's pressure and like,
Your dad would order food for you guys.
yeah. Well, when there's nine
You
people,
just ate what he
yeah.
gave you.
Yeah. And so
Oh,
you go
yeah.
from not having any sort of agency and the ability to make choices to this
Hmm.
environment where like the American consumer public is all about the illusion of choice.
Choice. Right. Right.
So it's it's a lot of culture shock of going from that and then recognizing that people don't have your best interests at heart. They're out for themselves. And in the sort of environment, you don't see that right away. When you're in this homeschooling bubble, you don't see that. On top of that, you don't have a lot of the cultural references. So you stumble into jokes that you didn't mean to, that you didn't know, that a
Right.
lot of things that are obvious for everybody around you, you just don't know. This can be things as simple as like hygiene, all the way to
Right.
like things that you shouldn't say because, it's culturally not appropriate to say that you've just never
Right.
learned. I think a lot of people in our modern world sit through this sort of like HR training and like, well, why would anybody need this? And it's like, well, it's because people like me need that. People that weren't raised in America, in the American
Culturally. Yeah.
culturally, don't have this frame of reference. And like that is kind of pretty jarring to go from those two different things. And I think it's very scary. It was very scary. I felt that I had to do it for myself,
Hmm.
but I recognize that a lot of people who are my peers, that's really daunting and it's really hard. And I have a lot of sympathy and empathy and compassion for people in that situation because it is hard. And if it's not easy, and the world will feel real, like the culture of our country and just having jobs and existing will feel really, really hard, just emotionally, just
Yeah.
intellectually, just the system. It doesn't make sense. On top of the fact that it is a kind of a cutthroat, hard system, even for people who grew up in it.
Yeah, it is. And college wise, you started at a community college, correct?
Yes. So where I live, we didn't have to be reported to school once we turned 16. Once I turned 16, my parents stopped. It had largely kind of stopped at that point. We were past what my mom could teach and what time that was available in the day. I mean, there were a lot of us. It was hard. There was a lot. There's a lot going on. And I started working for people, for family in agriculture and for friends in agriculture that we knew. And I started a program in a community college near me that was really good, that allowed people to get their high school diploma and
Okay.
college credits. Well, like I talked about, the English comprehension was really good for me. So I was
Mhm.
able to test out of all of that. And I just had to take some math classes to catch up. And from then, I was at the age of 16, 17, taking a full college, community college schedule and working.
And that sounds exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was landscaping and milking cows in the summer and college and milking cows in the winter. And I drove an hour to college one way and to the dairy farm at night. It was a half an hour. And so I put tons of miles on my truck and had lots of sleepless nights. I'd get like 4 or 6 hours of sleep. I will say that I like it's hard. If you want to do it, you can do it, but it does take a toll. It's like pretty exhausting. So like community college was really, really great. They set up, it was very inexpensive. It's heavily subsidized, and it's set up for people to go back, so I was in classes with adults in their 30s and 40s going back to school to like set themselves up. I'm sure there were people that had been to prison that were there trying to set their life back. There were veterans that were like coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan at the time, like, okay, I want to get a
Hmm.
degree now. There were high school kids that were getting their AP classes. There was me who had never gone to high school that was, and then there were all the normal or college age kids. And so it was a great environment to learn in, to sort of learn the American cultural system.
Yep.
I really thrived once I got to a place where there were teachers that knew what they were doing and that had been trained in and wanted to teach. There were the college I had a lot of like these extra things for like writing, math that you could go to and work with tutors.
Yep.
That was really, really helpful because despite the fact that I had great English reading and writing comprehension, I was a terrible writer, had never really written anything, and had was pretty bad at spelling and grammar and structure and all of that. So that was really, really helpful.
Yeah, my English grammar is abysmal.
Yeah, like I wrote like I was talking,
Yep.
and then there was a lot of things where like, well, no, no, you should break this into sentences. These are where
Yep.
commas go. This doesn't make any sense to anybody outside your head. and yeah, so there was a lot of that happened at community college that
Hmm.
was really good. I'm glad that I went to community college. Community college was the thing that got me out and able to like function as an adult. I had to go to the cafeteria and learn how to order things. I had to like commute there every day. I had to do all these things. And in community college is sort of a low stakes game where there's a lot of, or low stakes system where there's a lot of discretion and space given to the students. I like there were students that were obviously like sort of bamboozling their way through this thing.
Hmm.
And, oh, my grandparents died. Oh, my grandparents died again. And, like getting,
Right.
the whole gamut of things. And there was, wasn't this as like adversarial system.
Hmm.
When I went to university after that, I transferred. That was a much more adversarial system. And
Right.
they were sort of trying to get you, and it was about surviving and lasting. That transition between those two was very helpful. Homeschooling wasn't. The few things I mentioned, were helpful, but for the most part, I came out of homeschooling feeling more in common with like the immigrants that I was doing landscaping alongside of than
Right.
the customers that we were working for.
Right. Right.
And that's not to say those customers were super wealthy. They were just normal American people that had done well in the system and could afford to have their flower beds mulched once or twice a year.
Yep. Yep.
And a patio put in. That was, we weren't the uber wealthy.
What ideas or advice do you have for young people who are struggling to adapt to life post homeschooling? You talked a little bit about what you found helpful, which seems to
Mm-hmm.
be community college. But what other ideas or advice would you have for young people who are?
Community college, I think, was really great. There are a lot of online communities that exist out there that are
Hmm.
full of people who have gone through similar experiences, sort of in various stages of coming to terms with that, understanding it, joking about it, finding a new life. Particularly around the Duggars, I think it came up in some of the documentaries. There was the first one I think was like Free Ginger, and then there was Recovering Grace, and those places just to read through and see other people experiencing the same things because it's very isolating
Yeah.
growing up in this. But when you realize that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people that have gone through the same thing, going through the same thing you are, that's really helpful. There's a lot of Reddit snark pages that are kind of criticizing and digesting and processing the sort of higher up people, the people lifted up, the
Hmm.
influencers of this community. And then, there's just a lot of, if you I don't know how true this is for the newer, the people coming after me, but I was kind of raised in the online forum era of the internet. where
Okay.
there's a lot of online forums and good and bad and all of that. But there was a lot of that that was really helpful. You could read about people's college experiences. You could read about every people were talking about everything online, and just seeing that was really helpful. When I had kids and was married and bought a house, there was a time where we needed like assistance. And once you went to those places and found the local agencies and communities that were doing those things, that they were really helpful. I think in general, like finding people that you can talk to about it. You've done a lot of therapy, and that's like really good. I mean, I think everybody should do therapy, even if they think they're perfectly fine. Therapy is just really, really good, and it's never been more accessible. I mean, I did BetterHelp and all that, and
Mhm.
you know the they're out there. It's out there, and you should do it. For me, there was a lot of like trying to find information and learn about like finances and jobs and like all of that sort of thing. I was a really bad interviewer for a while, probably still am, but like you have to like go out there and fail for a long time to get those
Yeah.
skills. And,
Were there
you know,
any job like some places do prep interviews and like I would do mock interviews with it like your the career center. Did you utilize the career center at college at all?
I did not. I should have. I
Okay.
was working too much to have time for it.
For it? Yep. Okay.
And so that was one of the things that like it was like, well, I don't have time, so I didn't. And then when I got, I stopped college, or when I graduated, it was like, well, I am behind on this. And I
Right.
graduated in December. I spent like 3 months applying for jobs online and getting nowhere. This
Yep.
was the Great Recession. They were not
Yep.
hiring people that didn't have experience. Because I only knew landscaping and construction, I worked in that. And it was a much longer, slower process to get a job that utilized my degree.
Yep.
And so there's like that was hard. And it didn't help that like I didn't have a normal high school transcript or like
Right.
pathway. It you you know when you're applying online, you're applying into a computer system. You're not applying to a
Yeah.
person. And if you
Yep.
don't fit that system, well, you're just the first one that goes in the trash. It's not like you just go walk into the company and say, "Hey, I want work," and they'll admire your go get them attitude and hire you.
Right.
It's an algorithm screening you
Right.
before you get there. And so that's really hard. It took a lot of work and sort of creativity to find a very niche place to get in and to
Hmm.
utilize the skills I had. Most of the jobs I got were because I knew people, and they were people within the group that I was living in. And so that's good and bad. Because it's good, they trust you because you're in their system, and it's bad
Right.
because if it goes south, it's all the same people. It's like very hard to have
Yep.
boundaries. It's
Right.
and you're maybe put into things that you don't have the skill set for, just because, oh, hey, you're my friend.
Right. Right. Yeah. Talk a little bit more about setting boundaries and how
Mm. So like
because
homes,
that's an issue for trauma
yeah,
survivors is really learning how to set boundaries. So can you talk a little bit about that?
yeah, like I think I really struggle with that even still. Like
Hmm.
I'm someone that wants to make everybody happy and
Yep.
just move forward and not have conflict. I'm not,
Yep.
I was really hard to sort of like exist with conflict. And our system that we live in has a lot of conflict, and it is on you to create boundaries. And
Yep.
so therapy was really good with that, learning boundaries and recognizing that, okay, I have the ability to stand up and say, no, I don't like this, or to walk away. I can, set what I want in my life. But that was nowhere in homeschooling or in the Christian
Right.
movement. That was all very hard. And it you're a bit at a disadvantage because the leadership and your parents and all those people, they have more of that than you do, but they're not
Right.
teaching it to you.
Right.
so much. And so you're a little bit like left out in the cold. And
Mhm.
yeah, that's like really a big challenge that I don't know. It's like a big struggle as an adult to sort of figure out.
Do you want to read the summary and
Sure.
take us out?
Yeah. Homeschooling may not be traumatizing for people. It can set up a youth for being a victim of religious abuse in the following ways: religious expectations to be idealized versions of Christians, since the outside world is not influencing you. When a child grows up without exposure to many other groups, he or she may not know how to learn how to set boundaries and discern who is trustworthy and who isn't. A tenet of many homeschooling curriculum and religious right communities is government should not help people. So any programs such as food stamps, subsidized housing, and free community college are seen as interfering in God's punishment of sinners. This means many states do not have adequate funded safety nets for young people to help them get out of controlling communities and dead end jobs. Trauma is created in these cases not by the event, but by a cumulation of events, belief, and lack of access for help.
Anyway, if you liked our podcast, drop us a note at condemnedhappy@gmail.com, and we'll see you again. Have a great day.
Bye.